I'm Michael Pierce, and here's another topic I would like to talk about is oil is not as rare or unplentiful as studies have shown in the past. I remember growing up throughout the late 80s that I remember in the 90s that oil was always like it's a limited supply. It takes hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of years for it to be made. It's made from it's a fossil fuel, so it's only from some sort of fossilized material or older material that the oil has come over a long period of time. For some time, I have believed that the very opposite is true. That the process does not take nearly as long, in that oil not only replenishes itself very quickly, but based on the small amount of research I've done, is that it is also more plentiful and widely available in different locations than previously stated. And the first thing I would like to introduce you to is an article that kind of put me onto this idea. This article comes from a study that was done. Let me put the browser up here. Is a breakthrough, and this article calls it quick cooking. Another article from Wired magazine called it flash cooking, that pressurized and superheated within under a minute. As you can see here, let me bring this a little closer, is that cooking algae under pressure and at a high temperature was able to produce a very high percentage of transforming the algae into biocrude oil. So this form of crude oil could also then later be refined. If the process was refined, there's a little bit more steps to take in biocrude, but essentially getting into the apparatus of being able to get the usable oil is very similar to what I started to think about this. When I started to think about this process, I started to think to myself, where can this occur naturally in the wild? And that's what put me into the idea. What can do this? What can pressurize and superheat organic material to make oil? And the conclusion I came to was subduction zones. So if you're not familiar with subduction zones, let me kind of paint a little picture for you. So I got my MS Paint here. Let me move my OBS over here. And so here's what a subduction zone is. As you may know, we have these things that we live on called land, which for the most part are on continental shelves. So what are continents? And we have this little thing called a continental shelf where we have basically a drop-off. The difference between, perhaps you can say, like the ocean floor and, let me make this a little bit, I don't know, more slopey. So there's a portion, because basically these continents are basically like floating islands on the not the bedrock, but on the foundation of basically magma, of different layers of the earth, that you basically have, in essence, that these continents kind of float around the surface of the earth. And when new material is brought up from the middle of the ocean, so in the Pacific you have like the Mariana Trench, where basically volcanic activity is basically pushing matter up from underneath the surface of the earth, pushing it forward, pushing it up, and then pushing land or seafloor out towards the continents. When it reaches the continents, immense pressure forces these, like the ocean floor, under portions of the continental shelves. Over a period of time, this process can even create underwater ridges, as this kind of like earth-moving material is earth-moving process can create a lot of different things. And so you have all this going on under the surface of the ocean. So when I'm looking at this process of this study that came from 2012, and I'm looking for natural processes that may exist that where this occurs naturally, here's what we're looking at. We're looking at a process where when we have the continental shelf, the ocean floor going underneath the continental shelf, you have immense pressure, immense temperatures, as you have this perfect storm that can take all the material. Think about this. All the algae, all the fishies, whatever. All the organic life that exists in the ocean over the period of time it takes for the ocean floor to develop from the Mariana Trench until the time that it reaches the continent, you have a seabed of this ocean floor becoming hyper rich with organic material. Who knows how far down in this ocean floor this is potential material? I don't know. So part of this process, when this gets pushed down, it is going into this process where it is being pressurized, superheated, and when it's superheated, it gets to the point perhaps where it's evaporating or it's bubbling. I think evaporation is the likely process, and it's because if it is basically being distilled at some portion of this, that would mean that this organic material will then be rising up through any sort of cracks it can find in the continental shelf. And once it rises up, it's going to find any sort of cavity to fill. And once it gets in this cavity, likely settle in here and eventually just become back into some sort of liquid form, like we find crude oil. And eventually we have people that come by with these offshore drilling facilities that's able to drill down, find these cavities, and that's where we're extracting a lot of our offshore oil from these ridges that are capturing the oil that is being produced by a natural process. So when I start looking at this is what I'm thinking is happening. And so further with that, the more that I start looking, say, at, let's pull up our map here. We got our browser. Let's see here. Let's reset this, refresh, browser go. There we go. So let's look at this. So one of the things that I start looking at on Google Earth is when I was first looking at this process was I was basically just looking for underwater ridges. So one of the first things I did was basically I knew there were oil facilities in Alaska, I just didn't know where. So one of the first things I started doing is basically just poking around everywhere in these ridges. And when I started to find where and I started researching the location of oil rigs, that they were consistently on these ridges. So there are offshore oil facilities that are out here in Alaska that basically are connected directly to where these ridge lines are. And it's the same for areas such as the Gulf of Mexico, where this is a huge bed of where offshore oil exists. And without even researching if oil rigs existed, I went over to Africa. I come to somewhere like Nigeria that's kind of like the one of the more active areas of where I see potential offshore oil right here. And I come here, I see this activity, I start looking up what kind of offshore oil facilities Nigeria has, and I come to find out, just recently that they've discovered oil as far as 2014, new areas of oil that they are now able to extract, that they have a lot of, outside companies that are very interested in this area. And I bet you it's consistent. I bet you with all these areas, you're going to find the exact same natural process is occurring. That we basically have here is that fossil fuels are not a non-renewable energy source. That in fact, it is probably one of the most renewable energy sources, that we do have a natural process, that as fossil fuels are burned, they go into what we know as the carbon cycle. That organic life, such as algae, trees, algae especially, let's not even talk about anything that's green on the land, because when we really think about it, it's the ocean. The ocean is the filter of the carbon cycle of the Earth. So what happens is that, naturally, volcanic material, volcanoes, seismic, basically all the natural processes that would put gas in the air naturally over time would basically be swallowed up by the ocean. You have an agitation that occurs on the ocean surface that helps bring in this material. Algae then absorbs that material. Algae is used as part of the food chain of the ocean. A large portion of algae also dies and settles on the ocean floor. That material then eventually gets sucked back down under the under subduction zones. Some of it escapes again through different volcanic activity once again. But it's kind of like, that's a cycle. It's a process. So when we're talking about renewable energies, we're talking about needing a way to assist in man's burning of these oil and petrol material. So what we need is basically something that duplicates the same process that the ocean does, some sort of way of agitating or bringing in air that is very carbon filled. So you're looking at places like China, very deregulated when it comes to how fossil fuels are burned. I would think that a place like this would be most interested in trying to develop a way to create filters that can bring in the air and put it through perhaps some sort of water agitation filter that has natural organic material like algae that can absorb the carbon and other toxic material that's going into the air, so they can balance what they burn and help clean their air. There's also a lot of other processes that can also occur to make a lot of the burning process cleaner, so it's not as big of a pollutant. And that's going to be the same thing with anything that we do in the United States as well. But as far as I'm concerned, one of the major things that we need to do, and let me get back to our little terrible paint thing over here. One of the biggest things that I would want to do is the fact that we still don't know what the potential the potential that we have in the ocean. So one of my simplest proposals is basically send a boat out, and anyone that has the ability to do a core sample as far down as we can on the ocean floor before a continental shelf where we already know there's oil, and just do a potential test of how much potential oil is in a small 1-inch tube core sample going down. Flash cook that entire sample, and how much biocrude oil do we get out of it? Use that as a basis of doing a mathematical calculation of how much oil can potentially be made per year, because we know the rate at which the ocean floor is subducted under the continental shelf. We can calculate this and understand what the potential oil production may be from a natural process. That this isn't something that's occurring over millions of years. It's 1,000 years process, but it's 1,000 years of material that's already good to go. it's almost the entire ocean floor is part of that process, and it's finally getting to the continental shelf. It's already deeply rich with material, and that's going under the continental shelf at a rate of like about 1 inch a year, if I remember that calculation correct. So what is 1 inch a year across the entire coastline of the continents of the Earth, right? This is what we're looking at. Look at this distance is ridiculous. Even if it's 1 inch that's going under a year, that we're looking at a number that is huge. And what you can do is basically start looking directly at these ridges for any sort of potential oil cavities, cavities that will be filled by oil. Maybe you can use some sort of like seismic gear that can send seismic waves into these ridges and see if it comes back with anything that's not solid. And if it's not solid, it might be a good place to try to explore for potential oil. So I just wanted to get my little theory out there with the hopes that maybe one day I can catch someone's imagination with it, and maybe we can actually get a boat sometime, go out there, Let's do a core sample and find out exactly how much oil is being produced each year by this process. So those are my thoughts. If you have anything to add, please leave them in the comments below. And I thank you for your time and see you next time.